If you've seen all of Rings of Power Season 2, then you understand just how much better it is than the first season. During Season 1, I felt like I was making excuses for the show, clinging on to bits and pieces that showed promise, but I also knew in my heart that the full result wasn't quite there yet. When reviewing Season 2, I need none of those caveats, and I dare say that Season 2 is objectively good. I don't like every element of the show, there's things that I'll criticize in this video, but those things no longer dampen my excitement for the show as a whole. And before we get started, I'm going to give a big spoiler warning for literally everything that's happened this season. So originally, after the first season ended, I was quite worried that there wasn't enough time for the showrunners to take fan feedback into account to make the second season better. They started shooting the second season only a few weeks after the first season aired, which means all of the scripts, storyboarding, and planning that would go into the second season were likely already finished by the time season 1 ended. But against all odds, Patrick McKay and JD Payne crafted something truly special here, and they did that by focusing on the right things. To me, season 1 felt like the showrunners were too intent on giving time to the stories that they created themselves, rather than relying on the words that Tolkien left behind to guide the narrative. We spent way too much time with the Harfoots, the Stranger, and the Southlands. And what we did get from the Elven and Númenorian storylines was something that didn't feel familiar. Galadriel just felt off, and the politics of Númenor weren't explored to their deepest capabilities. And that's the taste that was left in most fans' mouths while waiting the 2-year gap for season 2. But immediately, once I turned this show back on for its second effort, I knew something had changed. Sauron and the elves took center stage, and everything else seemed to fall into the background. We learned more about why Sauron was depicted as a human last season, and I liked the rationale. The elves were acting like elves, and they were rightfully concerned about the power that these rings could yield, both good and bad. These are the things that most fans of the lore thought would be the focus of the show on day 1. And it took a little while to get there, but I'm happy to say that the wait did pay off. Going further, the relationship between Galadriel and Elrond felt real this season. He called her on her insolence many times over. And the show created a great dynamic where you never know if Galadriel's acting in the best interest of the elves or in the best interest of her ring. And walking that line is what made this journey with the elves so exciting. And as a result, Galadriel's actions from last season are also somewhat explained when you learn just how great of a deceiver Sauron can be. And that obviously gets explored in the relationship between Sauron and Celebrimbor. That's the real standout this season, and anyone who's seen the show probably feels the same way. Sauron's deception of Celebrimbor feels earned, and it's exactly what I envisioned reading the appendices of The Lord of the Rings and the Alcalibeth so many years ago. Every step of the way, Sauron's promises and demands felt logical. Of course Celebrimbor would believe that Annatar is a Maiar after that display of power. Of course he would want to outdo his grandfather Feanor with rings that can eclipse the power of the Silmarils. And of course, his unmaking ends up being his own, and the hubris of the elves is on full display. But every time he and Annatar were on screen, I was filled with delight. I think Charles Edwards and Charlie Vickers both deserve Emmy nods for these roles, and I'm sad we can't just have these two sitting in a room together for as long as the rest of the show goes. I vividly remember watching the 7th episode and just mouthing the word thank you because I was so happy with how this storyline was playing out. But speaking of the 7th episode, this show officially proved that it can stand on its own with battle scenes. And by battle scenes, I mean battle episodes more accurately. The largest scale anything we got last season was the battle in the Southlands, and it felt a bit dull and uninspired. It felt like it was there because the showrunners just knew they needed a battle in that season. But my god, the sack of Eregion was handled beautifully. The ferocity with which Elrond and Arondir were fighting amongst the fires of the fields was astounding to watch, and it was made all of the better knowing what was going on inside Celebrimbor's tower at the same time. You really felt like Sauron's plan was coming to fruition, but that last inch he needed was met with a resistance of light that felt like it could outshine the darkness. And even though he ends up getting the 9 rings, it doesn't feel like he fully won the day. Celebrimbor's words stung him, and you can see that as Sauron shoves the spear into Celebrimbor's side. And I think those words will haunt Sauron for the rest of the show. We'll always see him in the back of our minds as a slave to the rings. And that's a beautiful dichotomy that the showrunners found here. These little moments and lines are things that, in my opinion, improve upon the text. They take Tolkien's words and add double and triple meanings. And that's what a good adaptation is meant to do. However, after Sauron kills Celebrimbor, I didn't feel like we needed that extra moment with him and Galadriel. I liked the battle sequence with Sauron's shape-shifting to play on her emotions, but it felt a touch bit overdone to me. It felt like we just got this poetic end to a season-long storyline between him and Celebrimbor, and we didn't need another superhero moment to make Galadriel seem cool. And just before this, the way that Sauron twisted Adar's orcs against him was definitely an apt ending for the character, but it felt too predictable since the show kept highlighting Adar making bolder choices concerning the orcs. So these were 2 missteps in an otherwise fantastic run with the elves. I can't wait to see the elves building up Rivendell in season 3, and it falls right in line with the lore from this time period. I also can't wait to see what Sauron does with the 9, and what he'll make now that he has Feanor's hammer in his grasp. It'll be the One Ring. I can wholeheartedly say with my full chest that Rings of Power Season 2 nailed the elves. And they needed to. The elves are one of the two main elements that need to work in a Rings of Power story. The other main element is the men of Númenor, and I just cannot say the same about the quality of their storyline this season. But in my mind, this is not a huge deal yet. Númenor will become very important in this story very soon, just as important as the elves were this season. And once we reach that point, I can only hope that the showrunners will develop the intricacies of the politics of Númenor to the same extent that they did with Sauron's deception in Eregion. After all, they've done it once before. They took a storyline that was not the sole focus of Season 1 and did it justice with more screen time in Season 2. So I'm hoping they can do the same with Númenor in Season 3 or Season 4. But the longer it takes to get to that point will only make matters worse if it doesn't deliver. When shit hits the fan, we need to believe in these characters. We need to care about these people enough to love or hate them. And right now I'm pretty indifferent to most of them because A, the show does a lot of hand-holding telling you who to root for, and B, the people in Númenor don't act like real people. Everyone behaves in the most extreme way. It lacks subtlety on all accounts. From the slap that Miriel takes to the outcries at her coronation, it's painfully obvious that there are no whispers in Númenor. Every display of power is public, and the citizens of this island nation can have their hearts and minds entirely swayed in a matter of minutes. I could have used a lot more in-depth political discussion in the Númenorian storyline. I want to know why Pharazôn's side hates the elves, and I want to know why Miriel needs the Palantir. When Arianne brings forth the stone at Miriel's coronation, Miriel offers absolutely no explanation as to why she uses it or why the citizens, who are very concerned, would benefit from it. All she says is, "It's mine, we need it." Like, use your words, Miriel. It's your eyes that don't work, not your mouth. There were many things like this that built up as minor frustrations throughout the third and the fourth episodes, and they served as constant reminders that the show still has some work to do. But as the season progressed, I feel like they did make up a bit of ground. When Kemen killed Valandil, Isildur's friend, I didn't think that felt too forced. I actually think there was some good shock value in that death, and it helps Arianne realize that she might not be playing for the right team. Her arc this season was also one that lacked subtlety, but I was happy to see her more so siding with her father by the end. And speaking of Elendil, I have a caveman brain, so when he pulls out Narsil in the same exact way that Aragorn pulls out Anduril in Return of the King, I thought that was a pretty nice touch. However, I thought Pharazôn declaring all of the faithful traitors to the city was pretty half-baked. He just hands over a piece of paper with Sauron's name on it with no proof of wrongdoing, and then sends his guards to pilfer through the entire city with no justification. I just refuse to believe that the politicians of the most sophisticated realm of men in the world would act this way. And to me, at this point, they seem no more sophisticated than the men of the Southlands. So going back to my first point, the writers really need to commit to more subtlety in Númenor. I'm still holding out hope for a truly outstanding Númenor arc, maybe in Season 3 or Season 4, but it was definitely a low point for me this year. Moving back to a positive aspect this season, let's talk about the Dwarves. It's no secret that Prince Durin was one of the best parts of Season 1, and that does not change here. His internal conflict with his father is the star of the show, and it feels natural from start to finish. And the reason that it feels so natural is all of the love that the Dwarves have gotten in both Seasons 1 and 2. I liked seeing Prince Durin as a pauper, having to work up the courage to challenge his own pride and make up with his father. And that dynamic is obviously heightened when the Dwarven rings become involved. I thought King Durin's descent into greedy madness came a little bit too quickly, and I would have preferred a slower burn here. But I think it's okay in the grand scheme of things because dwarves have weaker minds than elves. And I already feel myself getting excited to meet the men next season who will fall even more quickly to the subjugation of the rings. I did hear some chatter online that people were upset that the Balrog came back in Season 2 because it goes against the timeline established in the lore. But in my mind, I already reconciled with the way that they're treating the timeline when the show was announced, so it doesn't make sense to bring up old baggage. Especially when the way that they used the Balrog this season was so epic. But switching gears, before I get to the Harfoots and the Stranger, Gandalf, let's quickly touch on the other men in the Southlands, namely Isildur. There's not much to cover about him this season, but we did learn a little bit more about who he is as a person. He's the type of person to hold on to a secret about his mother's death. He's the type of person to look past his little girlfriend's affiliation with Adar. And he's the type of person to still be honorable while he's doing those things. You can see a tinge of darkness behind his honor, and becoming familiar with this personality trait will be key for the audience to understand him as he makes certain decisions later on. But now, finally, what you've all been waiting for. The stranger is Gandalf. He's Gandalf. I don't know why I still held on to the hope that he might be a blue wizard after all of the signs that he would be Gandalf, but nevertheless, it feels good that we don't have to speculate on this anymore. Sure, it isn't exactly what Tolkien wrote, Gandalf going east, but At this point, I'm just over it. I've kind of accepted that this was going to happen for a while now, so I'm not as outraged as I was when this idea was first presented to me. Throughout this season, he was tested by Tom Bombadil to find out who he truly is, and I feel like a lot of those moments were heavy-handed. It was pretty obvious that Tom put him through a test to save his friends in the last episode, and I didn't need to hear Gandalf repeat that out loud for the audience. But overall, this subplot didn't get much screen time, and it was better for it. The parts where we saw the Harfoots and the Stranger mattered, and we didn't need some big complex plotline to get the point across. Their adversaries, though, could have used some fleshing out. We now have another wizard with an identity problem, and I'm already dreading the speculation as to who the Dark Wizard could be. However, a positive that comes from how this storyline ended is that it feels like Gandalf and the Harfoots are parting ways. I wonder if this means that the Harfoots will go away now that Gandalf has his own quest to go on, but I suspect that this isn't the last we've seen of Nori Brandyfoot. I would prefer less hobbits, because this story about the rings doesn't particularly need them. So I hope they were just being used to show why Gandalf has an affinity for that race, and now he can move on to bigger and better things. But that just about wraps it up. Like I said, I have criticisms of the show, and most times I end up talking about them more than I do the positives, because it's easier to highlight the things that didn't go to plan. But the reality is, I enjoyed watching about 80% of what I saw this season. Watching Charlie Vickers' Sauron dance around in Celebrimbor's head was beautiful, and I feel like the entire race of elves was handled with such care. The dwarves similarly were treated with respect, and my only real in-depth complaint was the Númenorian storyline, which isn't at its peak yet anyway. By nature, I'm an optimistic person, and I always knew that this show had the capacity to be great. And I'm happy to say finally that it has earned that moniker amongst me and many other fans who decided to give the second series a chance. But what do you think? Do you think the second season was a drastic improvement, or do you think it was just more of the same? Let me know in the comments, but please do so respectfully. Please like this video and subscribe if you feel so inclined to do so. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good one.